You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.
And welcome back to WCDB Albany. My name is Eric Hardiman, and this is The Social Workers live on WCDB. I'm here with my regular co-host, Alyssa Lotmore. Welcome back, Alyssa.
Hey, Eric. We have a great show lined up today.
We do have a great show lined up today. We have a special guest with us on the phone. We have a guest. His name is Kevin Hofmann. Kevin is a speaker, author, and trainer. He's an accomplished writer and public speaker. He's appeared across the United States sharing his experience and guiding parents, students, and professionals through today's multicultural landscape. He's been interviewed by a range of media, including Nightline ABC and National Public Radio, and he's quickly becoming a trusted voice on the topics of race and adoption. His book, which is entitled Growing Up Black in White, is a compelling memoir revealing his difficulties and joys growing up in a diverse family. Because his story also addresses the impact of race and culture in society, it serves as a catalyst for open discussions on diversity and inclusion, as well as race and culture. Kevin lives with his wife and two sons in Toledo, Ohio, and we are very excited to have Kevin on the phone today. Kevin, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thanks for having me.
Great. We're excited to have you on The Social Workers. Just to let you know a little bit about our show, Alyssa and I can tell you that we've been running this show on air now for over 5 years.
Yeah.
And we interview a range of subjects. Some folks are writers like yourself. Some are social workers. Some are community members. We have legislators. We have all sorts of figures that we like to interview and talk about, not just social work, but about issues like the ones that you'll talk about today that relate to social work and relate to the community at large.
Oh, great. That was interesting.
So we're thrilled that you're here with us today. And let's just jump right into your book. And it's such an interesting topic, and your memoir. And why is this important to you to get this message out and to share your story?
I think it's because, well, when I first sat down to write the book, I thought, man, what an interesting story. This biracial kid, adopted by a white family, born 2 weeks after the riot in Detroit. And the riots were just a result of the black community and the white community just could not get along. And so I was born into that environment. And so, you know, when I talk about race, I always say, man, we've got to give it context. So that's my context when it comes to race, is on this biracial kid, grew up in Detroit, a city that's so splintered by race, coming into that environment and adopted by a white family. And then that white family moves to a black neighborhood, and all the schools that I go to throughout, you know, my life are 95 to 98% black. But then I still go home to this white house. And then in third grade, my dad gets a promotion. We moved from the black neighborhood to a white neighborhood. So, you know, I'm black by day at school, and then white on weekends where I go home to my white family and white friends in that white community. So when I wrote the book, I purposely wanted to talk about race in a way that people could digest it. And so the book is just all these kind of coming-of-age stories. When I was writing it, I heard Ralphie's voice from the Christmas story and how he told that story. And so that's the way I tried to tell it, which is just kind of these crazy stories of me and my best friend, who's this white guy. And just all the issues that we dealt with, and the underlying theme was just the powerful impact of race. And I wanted people to see that I'm just this black kid growing up in this country that has struggled with race since we began. And so how do we address those things? How do we have that conversation? And so that's why it's so important to me, is that it opens up a larger conversation. A smaller conversation for the adoption community and child welfare community is, my parents had no role models growing up. We were, I figured, probably the second wave of transracial we were part of. Yeah, the second wave of transracial adoption.
Okay.
First was probably early 50s, and then the Christian community started adopting transracially in the 60s. That was the second wave. And so my desire was, how about we help the families today kind of navigate their way through this? You know, no one was dropping breadcrumbs for us to follow. We figured it out the hard way. So my desire was give someone else the blueprint to follow that they can create confident children of color. And so that was really why I did it.
So what lessons did you learn growing up as a transracial adoptee? Especially you were in Detroit. There was a lot of racial tension at the time. What was your experience like?
So the three lessons I learned were, and so you have to understand the dynamics of our family. When my mom and dad adopted, they were literally told, just take him home. If he doesn't work out, bring him back.
Wow.
And that's all they were told. There was no such thing as post-adoptive care. And then the other thing they were told was just take him home and don't talk about adoption. He doesn't need to know that. And so we didn't talk about adoption. And we didn't talk about race, which is crazy because we were in the middle of it.
Right.
And so, yeah, one of the biggest lessons I learned was, not talking about race or adoption didn't make me not black and not adopted. And so, yeah, I really push when I do training. I'm a trainer for the state of Ohio, but I go all over and train adoptive families. And, yeah, that's the big lesson I teach them is you got to talk about them. You can't ignore it. Kids see racial differences as early as 6 months old. It's our job to make sense of that for them.
And when was it that you started talking about it? So at what point in your childhood, your youth, did you kind of realize that, oh, this is something I'm not talking about. This is something that, needs to be talked about. When did that shift happen for you?
And that's why, and here's the second lesson I learned, which was that growing up around kids that looked like me was life-changing. So my parents made the decision. We actually lived in Dearborn, which is a white suburb of Detroit, until I was 3 years old. My parents at 3 years old, after we woke up when I was a year old, cross burning on our front yard. We stayed in that community for 2 more years because I think my parents thought we can change this community. And they finally figured out this community is going to change us before we change it. So let's move. And they moved and purposely took a church in Detroit where the parsonage or the home where the pastor and his family lived is within a black neighborhood. They purposely did that to put me around people that look like me. And so those kids taught me so much about black culture. And so I was so fortunate that when I did have frustrations that I thought were race-related, I could go to my black friends and say, man, I think that woman down the street, that white woman down the street treats me horribly because I'm black.
Right.
And the only thing I wanted to hear was, yeah, man, you might be right. And I wasn't getting that from my white friends. My white friends wanted to debate why I was wrong. And I just needed someone to hear me. And that was one of the pushes for doing the book. I used to partner with a good friend of mine, a kid I grew up with, the white kid I grew up with. And we used to do diversity and inclusion training. And before we did that, he took me through this very annoying exercise. It's called the 5 Whys. So he had asked me, why'd you write the book? And my initial thought was, I wrote the book because I want to give this pass for, transracial families coming up behind me. Well, by the 5th why, my answer was because I simply wanted to be heard. I wanted people to hear me as a person of color, to hear me as an adoptee, and I wasn't getting that chance to that point.
So it also sounds like it was a process of being heard, but a process of finding your voice too, and sort of learning how to tell your story in your way and in a way that other people genuinely hear.
Yeah, I mean, I always had my voice. It was a hard time finding areas where I would listen.
Right.
So that's why it was invaluable. I mean, anytime you go through something, if you can find someone who can identify with your experience, man, that could be so healing. And so I had that. I had that with the black kids that I went to school with and all my black friends.
So what are some of the biggest challenges in the foster care and adoption community?
Oh, man, there's so many. So I spent a year as a recruiter for the Daytime Foundation. So I would work with my local agency to try and find families for children. And I remember, this is actually the last meeting I went to with the agency. So it's a matching meeting. So you bring in and you say, okay, here's a kid. Do we have any families that may be interested in this child? I had this teenage white girl, and I had found a family for her. And I presented that family to the agency, and the response was, well, what do you want us to do with this? We spend all our resources and time in getting the kids 5 and under adopted. We don't really work to get teenagers adopted. That was the beginning of the end for me. I soon quit after that because the system is so broken. But I'm actually really excited about doing this because hopefully what we really need is the young social workers to go out there, think outside the box, and dismantle, disassemble, and deconstruct the system that's now there.
Right.
Push against it, man, and find new ways to do things and get back to what we all talk about, which is, in the best interest of the child, and do a better job with that.
Yeah.
So you talk about the concept. I think in other forums you've talked about the concept of cultural intelligence. Can you tell us a little bit what you mean by that and sort of what that concept means to you?
Yeah. So this whole work has expanded. When I started to write the book, I was writing to the white mom who was raising a transracially adopted child, and what I didn't realize was there's a larger story here that I think so many other people should hear, and then hopefully help to heal, certain communities. And so I started to expand that, and I got into doing cultural intelligence work for schools, K through 12, universities, and organizations. And what cultural intelligence is, simply the way I put it, especially when I'm talking to schools, is it is my desire, and we've got to do this, create a space where the kid that wears the Make America Great Again hat and the kid that wears the Black Lives Matter t-shirt can coexist. And so and I give a keynote speech, which is called Gimme 3 Feet. And it's about an idea. When I grew up in Detroit, we used to play backyard basketball. And because we didn't have a whole lot of space to play basketball, oftentimes you'd be taking the ball out against a fence or a rose bush or a rose garden or something. So you didn't have a whole lot of room to get the ball in. So there's a rule so the person taking out the basketball would yell, give me 3. And that was a signal to the defender. It was a warning. It was actually, yes, a very calm warning, which meant, give me 3 feet or I'm going to throw the ball at you. And so from that story, I thought, man, what if we just did that? What if we encouraged kids in school that, yes, you can have whatever belief you want. You can identify any way you want within your own 3 feet. And that 3 feet doesn't have to impact my 3 feet. And so that's what I'm working with schools and organizations with is we've got to allow space where people can express themselves, not be attacked, and share their experiences and be respected. That's been the big push for me the last couple of years.
And do you find that audiences are increasingly open to this kind of work?
It's interesting. I'm doing a panel with a world organization on Monday, and we're talking about diversity. And the biggest challenge I have when going into schools is, I have a lot of schools now that have diversity councils or diversity groups, and they want to go at this, at the speed of light. They're like, let's change this, let's do this. But then there's a large group, mainly parents, that see nothing wrong with the way things are. And so how do you address that with, two groups at two different ends? So my hope is I share from my experience what it's like to grow up. I've been through schools that weren't so accommodating for me as a child of color. I share from that experience and encourage schools that, man, we just got to get back to being compassionate and logical, So, yeah, if we're doing something to hurt kids, how about we just stop it?
Right.
And that seems to resonate more with people, that we just need to create kinder environment.
Sure. Sure.
Now, your book talks a lot about transracial adoption, but is it individuals who perhaps are biracial or growing up? I'm a biracial individual. I grew up with my mother who is white. So can this book relate to maybe individuals who are biracial too, or like single parents who are raising a child who is biracial? Or is it more geared toward just like transracial adoption kind of aspects?
Kevin, did we lose you there for a second? Oh. I think we've lost Kevin.
We lost him. He should call back.
We lost the phone connection.
He's calling right back. So.
Yeah, sorry.
Great, that's
I don't know
okay.
what happened.
Could you hear my question, Kevin?
No. Say it again, please.
No problem. I was saying I'm a biracial individual, and I grew up, black and white, and I grew up with my mother she's a white woman she was a single parent. So could your book also cross the lines? Is it just really geared toward those who are for transracial adoption, or could it also gear toward or be helpful for individuals with the growing population of biracial individuals, sometimes being raised by single parents like myself?
Yeah. So probably the largest portion of the book is about racial identity and me struggling to find that in such an interesting environment. So the one thing I'm probably most proud of is I wrote the book 10 years ago. It's been out there for that long. 2 years ago, after going around the country and training on this, I noticed, especially when I trained foster and adoptive parents, they would all say, just tell me exactly what to do. My kid gets called a bad name in school. What should I do? So then I went back 2 years ago and added, I think, 40 pages in the back of the book. It's one chapter that says, this is what happened and this is what you do. And a lot of that is, helping parents to raise children who are very confident in who they are as children of color. So yes, I think it does a good job of it showing how I struggled with my racial identity, eventually got it. Mm-hmm. But I think, yes, it can help biracial kids who are struggling with who they are and to find a place.
But in relation to adoption, is transracial adoption for everyone? Going from, as you talk to people, as you're doing all of these trainings and workshops, is it something for everyone?
No. I am the son of a Lutheran minister, and so my dad shared a story with me when I was growing up that he used to counsel married couples. So they get engaged, they come into my dad, say, we want to get married in the church, and my dad would say, you got to go through this 6 weeks of counseling. And he said, my job was to convince them why they shouldn't get married. And those that chose, after all I put them through, to still get married, they stood a better chance of staying married. So I've kind of adopted that style of training, which is, I'm going to give you the cold, hard truth, the struggles, the joys, the pain, the sorrow, and then you get to make an informed decision whether you think transracial adoption is for you. And it is not for everybody. It is tough. Like I said, we woke up to a cross burning on our yard. My dad was blacklisted from the Lutheran Church in Southeast Michigan for at least 10 years. They lost friends over it.
Yeah.
It is not easy. And many will say, but we've gotten so much better today. Barack Obama was in the White House. I can tell you, man, going into schools today, there are words still used, horrible words still used in schools today that I thought we had gotten rid of long ago.
Right. Now, I'm also curious, back to the adoption piece for a second. We had a guest on recently on our show who wasn't talking about race and culture quite so much, but was talking about adoption and reunion and reunification and sort of the process of children who are adopted becoming adults and then seeking out their birth parents. And I noticed in your materials that you talk a little bit about the do's and don'ts of adoption, search, and reunion. Are there different issues for transracial adoption when folks are potentially looking for birth parents and considering going through that process and looking at reunion?
Yeah, so for me, my biological mother is white, my biological father is black. And I didn't know, because I didn't know who they were. I finally found out who they were, but I didn't know how they would accept this black person into their white family. So that was a huge concern for me, is not only trying to track them down, but then, will I be welcome here? I had no idea. So that was kind of an unusual twist. I think most adoptees that search, the biggest issue is this: am I going to get rejected again? Am I going to get kind of put off again? And so I think for transracial adoptees, especially biracial transracial adoptees, there was this issue of, would this white family accept me? And what were their feelings on race? And I had no idea.
So how has this all impacted your racial identity? And yes, you're going through these, you're thinking, will somebody accept? Will my, birth family accept me? Will, the adopted family, you had to go through this process of, acceptance and, feeling sometimes like people didn't understand. How has this all impacted your racial identity today?
Well, it's taught me that it's ever evolving. So I'm 52 years old and it's still evolving. It forced me to. So I grew up in a white household, and I figure I am probably 20 years behind my black peers when it comes to race and the understanding of impact, the understanding of the impact that race has. Because my black friends grew up and their families were telling them things that we've always told, each other in the black community. They were warning them that this is what you do when you get pulled over by the police. Yes sir, no sir. That's not the time to, debate curbside justice. Do whatever you have to do to get home. I wasn't getting those lessons when I was in my white household because my parents didn't know them to give them to me. Mm-hmm. And so it meant I had to spend a lot of extra time, and I did. I used to say, I grew up, this biracial kid, raised by a white family, going to black schools, and that I learned black culture through osmosis. I was just around it, so it just kind of seeped into me. That really isn't true. I learned it because I took the time, because my big fear as a transracial adoptee was that my black friends would think I was a fraud. And so I spent a lot of time and energy watching, learning, imitating, doing what I had to do to fit into that culture, because I knew early on because of how I present physically, the white community wasn't going to accept me as white. And so, my racial, it was a lot of work to really put this racial identity together. One of the biggest fears that the black community has about transracial adoption is, you are taking our children out of our community and you don't know how to raise them. You're not going to be able to raise competent children of color. And so this gives you an idea of my racial identity at an early age. When I lived in that black neighborhood, played with black kids all the time, I felt bad for my white brothers and sisters because they weren't black. That's a pretty positive racial identity.
Right.
So I think we got that right. But it's ever evolving. It's something that families really have to work at to instill that in kids.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen organically. Transracial adoption is a purposeful life. You've really got to do things to create the wanted result. And unfortunately, I'm seeing a lot of transracial families don't understand that. So
Go ahead. No, I was just going to say a lot of what I think I hear you saying, and I certainly hear from other folks that talk about this, is that the discussions, the conversation, are not one-time conversations. They're not. They're things that that we need to, as a community, as a society, need to continue talking about almost on a daily basis. That this is not something that you just talk about and resolve and then can move on and say, okay, we've figured this out. Mm-hmm. But that the learning, if you will, is something that is ever evolving and that needs to constantly be nurtured, maybe?
Yeah. So that's what I tell the transracial parents is, you got to start early and often. It's so much easier. And then, so all the studies show us this. Like I said, children recognize racial differences as early as 6 months old. Typically, in this country, we don't even address race till they're 8 or 10.
Right.
So we give them 8 to 10 years to figure out this thing that adults haven't figured out yet. But we don't even address it. We just tell them good luck. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is, so then we allow the children to set the definition. And I tell transracial parents, the conversation with adoption and race is a lot like the conversation about sex. Like, I was talking to a friend of mine, and she shared with me, I can remember exactly what I was wearing when my mother sat me down to tell me about sex. And I was like, man, it shouldn't be that traumatic. And I think when I talk to transracial families, they want me to tell them, okay, when the child's 5, sit him down, tell him he's black, and then go from there. And I tell them, no, it has to be this gradual thing that you do over time. And I'll know if you did it right when I go to your kids when they're teenagers and I ask them, so when did your mom and dad tell you you were adopted? Or when did your mom and dad talk to you about race? And if their answer is, I don't remember because we've always talked about it, then they got it right.
Right.
It doesn't have to be this traumatic thing. Like you said, it should be. Yeah, just bits and pieces along the way. And that sends the message, which I wasn't getting at home, which was that this is okay to talk about here.
Right.
That you can come, this is your safe place. And so when the world treats you horribly or treats you differently just because your skin is different, you can come home and we can talk about this. We didn't do that in my family, so when I did have those experiences, I swallowed them, and I deduced that I deserved it because I wasn't worthy. And that's a big theme for transracial adoptees.
This may be the $64 million question, and I apologize for asking a tough one, but why do you think those conversations have been so difficult for people? Why not have the conversations earlier? Why not, and the analogy to the sex conversation is also similar, but, I've often wonder what are the barriers? What are the cultural, community, societal barriers that keep us away from having those conversations more easily?
It comes down to simply we address what impacts us. So, I went to a meeting last night. I didn't have to worry if the building I was going into was ADA compliant or not because I'm not disabled. So that doesn't concern me. That's not on my radar every day. So I don't talk about it because it doesn't impact me. It's the same with race. Communities of color talk about it because we're impacted by it daily. There's a study in 2007 on race, and it said that white households are 3 times less likely to talk about race than households of color. And it's because we see it every day. I could take, and I've often wanted to do this, is just take a small camera with me when I go to the store, and I could point out little, we call them microaggressions today, but little slights that I get, which because I've had 52 years of training and identifying what racism looks like, I could point that out to people who would never have seen it if I wasn't there. And it's like the two communities are 2 different frequencies on the radio. I've tuned in to this one station for 52 years, so I know it, I understand it, and I see what the tendencies are there. If you've tuned into a different radio station that doesn't point that out, those things are, in a sense, invisible to you, so you don't talk about it.
So what are some, as we wrap up here, what are some larger lessons that we can learn from your book, your experience, from all of this? What are some last messages you'd like to give our listeners?
Well, the biggest lesson I've learned from writing the book is the book transcends just the adoption community. When I speak, I'll joke and say, but I do believe this. I think I was kind of genetically engineered to talk about this. I mean, I'm the child of a white mother who had an affair with a black coworker, and was forced to give this child up for adoption because her white husband made her. And then I was born into this city that was literally still smoking when I came out. And it was all due to these issues with race. So the bigger lesson is, because I've had this unusual way to grow up, I understand these issues with race in an unusual way. I grew up living with white people, so I understood, I understand white culture in a way that a lot of black people don't. And so I think it's that bigger conversation that we need to have from this small story. And it's just, and like I said, I've been able to go into, schools and universities and organizations, and we talk about the puzzles surrounding race, gender, religion, economics, abilities. And really it comes down to one simple solution, which I've talked about earlier, which is that oftentimes marginalized communities just simply want to be heard. And so when we come to you and we tell you we're fearful of the police because statistics prove and history prove that's not a pleasant interaction for communities of color. So when we say that, it is so frustrating. The response we get back is, no, you got that wrong. You didn't see it right. So when someone argues what I just saw as me not seeing it right, that is very frustration. And you put that on top of, usually we have these conversations of race and the police when something tragic happens. So I'm mourning the loss of a member of my community, and I'm expressing that, and what I'm getting back is why I shouldn't be expressing that, or why I saw it wrong. And that's the number one frustration when we talk about race, gender, differences in economics, abilities. We got to create that space where people can be heard.
Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your story, and also talking about your book, which again for our listeners is called Growing Up Black and White. The author is our guest today, Kevin Hofmann, and thank you so much for not only sharing your story with us today, but for also going around to schools and in your community and traveling to get this message out and to try to help have the communication be easier. I don't want to say the word easier, but more people are more open to having these dialogues instead of just when something happens. It's really being able to have these conversations all the time. And like you said, if somebody can't remember the time that they had that talk about race, that's a good thing because it's always been included in their daily dialogue.
Right, exactly.
So
we got to get better at that.
Kevin, I also want to thank you for calling in and for being on the show today. It's such a great conversation to have, and there's so much to learn for all of us. If listeners want to find out about your book and where they can find your book, where they can find you on social media, how can folks find you?
So, social media, I'm on Instagram, which is Kev Inclusion, so it's Kev Inclusion. Snapchat, same. Twitter, it's K8967, and then my website is just my name. So it's Kevin, Kevin, Hofmann, HOF as in Frank, MANN.com. And you can also find the website. It's also under Growing Up Black and White, the title of the book.
Great.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, and we'll be back in a little bit with our next guest.
And we look forward, Kevin, to hearing about your next project after this.
All right, appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.